Thanks, Lisa, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. You never know on these spring and summer days what it's going to be like, but it's hot outside, so we've got a nice air-conditioned room in here. So yeah, I am not currently working on any particular research projects, but what I'm going to present is sort of the culmination of a couple decades worth of research that has been done in the state of Ohio and how we're using that to implement bird conservation across the state and regionally and identify additional projects that we're working on. So we have a few grants that are in the works right now and projects just getting started. So I'm going to grab from a bunch of different research projects and talk about how we integrate those and work with partners like the Ohio Division of Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for sort of broad-scale conservation planning. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight is really sort of exemplifying what we can do as partners and sort of through collaborative efforts, whereas we can make some progress as individual entities, but sort of pulling these efforts together, we can sort of make a much larger impact. And the organization that I coordinate is called the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative, and this is a consortium of organizations throughout the state and regionally working on bird conservation efforts. And this grew out of Partners in Flight. Some of you have probably heard of Partners in Flight. It's just like our statewide effort here, it's a consortium of organizations across the Americas working on bird conservation. Partners in Flight has around 150 organizations in that network. And around the late 1990s, there was an effort to step down a lot of those efforts to state chapters of Partners in Flight. And that is really where the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative was born out of. For a few years, there was a state chapter of Partners in Flight, and then that evolved into these bird conservation initiatives. There is a national North American Bird Conservation Initiative that was established in 1999. And OBCI was established in 2004, so we're actually celebrating 20 years of collaborative bird conservation in the state of Ohio. I hired the first program coordinator in 2005, and I've been in this role since 2016. Like I said, this is a collective of organizations really interested in anyone who's working on bird conservation. So we have lots of metro park organizations in the network, folks like the Ohio Division of Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, universities, NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, bird observatories, and more we're also trying to engage private business in bird conservation as well. Particularly as we sort of move into urban landscapes and try to address conservation, important conservation issues in these urban landscapes. Those private partners are becoming increasingly important. So through OBCI, we have a steering committee that's made up of representatives from partner organizations throughout the network. Typically that's around a dozen different leads. We currently have 9 folks representing partners from around the state. We have a couple committees that sort of help OBCI function, including a research committee that's been very active, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about today has specifically come out of that Conservation Research and Planning Committee, as well as an outreach committee. We also organize a statewide scientific conference specifically focused on bird research, and we held the first one of those through OBCI this past fall. So, you know, we're fortunate as bird biologists in that we have these really big data sets covering large spatial and temporal spans that we've been able to work with for a long time. And we can really use birds as a conservation model for thinking about how we can address conservation issues, population declines with other taxa, whether it's things like butterflies or mammals or any other organism that we're interested in. We can sort of use what has been done with birds as a template because people have been fascinated by birds for so long. Citizen science really emerged out of bird watchers. We have the Christmas bird count, which was started in North America in 1900. Bird banding programs going all the way back to 1909. And one of the most important data sets that conservation biologists have used is the North American Breeding Bird Survey. which was the first sort of broad-scale standardized survey across the Americas. And this series of dots all over the map are the routes that are run all over North America every year. So volunteer bird watchers sign up to do these. They go to 50 locations along these routes, and they count birds. And they've been doing that since 1966. And a lot of the information that we have on avian population declines comes from that breeding bird survey. There's also been breeding bird atlas projects, and that was my introduction to Ohio. I came here about 15 years ago to coordinate the state's second breeding bird atlas, and we're actually in the planning stages right now for the third atlas, which I'll talk a little bit at the end of the talk tonight. I'm really excited about that effort. More recently, eBird has become very popular. This was a program that was developed between the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and National Audubon Society in 2002, and it has since that time become the largest ecological database in the world. eBird data, which is just observations submitted by bird watchers. There are probably people out in the park right now that are eBirding. Their contributions make up over half of the data in GBIF. That's the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So all of the data that we know about all of the organisms on Earth, over half of that has come from eBird in the last 20 to 22 years. It's amazing how it's grown. And this figure here on the bottom is sort of a chart of eBird submissions since its inception. You can see that it's exponential growth. It's amazing what we can do with eBird data now. And I'll talk a little bit about how we as researchers and conservation biologists are integrating data from efforts like eBird and the things that they're able to do with it. I have meetings all the time with researchers at the Cornell Lab and through the Migratory Bird Joint Ventures, and we had one just this past week talking about state wildlife action plans, and there are new products that have just come out of Cornell that are really amazing with what they can do with that. And these data sets, like the Breeding Bird Survey and eBird, have really allowed us to take a deep dive into what's happening with our bird populations and start to explore some of the drivers associated with those changes. Some of you have probably seen the headlines that came out a few years ago. There was a really big paper published in the scientific journal Science. This is the biggest, most impactful scientific journal in the world. And researchers through this study found that we've lost 3 billion birds from the North American landscape since 1970. That's a lot of birds from North America, if you think about it. And so, if we put that into context for different taxonomic groups or different fields, we can think about it as 3 and 4 eastern meadowlarks gone from North America during that time period. 2.5 billion, with a B, migratory birds lost during that time. So the vast majority of these birds are migratory. They're neotropical migrants, meaning they're overwintering in Central and South America, and they're migrating to temperate and boreal North America. And so there's a lot going on there that we're trying to unpack to understand what exactly is going on with those population declines and how can we mitigate them to conserve these populations. And so we can think about this model for bird conservation, sort of hierarchical conservation planning. So that's a jumble of words, but what does that really mean? So we can think about looking at this at different spatial scales and working with partners at different spatial scales. So across the entire Western Hemisphere, we have organizations like Partners in Flight. Their job is to bring organizations together to conserve birds across the Americas. They work closely with federal agencies like U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and NRCS, who in turn sort of filter down information to the state level. The Ohio Division of Wildlife is a great example of that. And then that continues to filter down to more local levels, like park districts, who are incredibly important at sort of actually implementing some of that work and feeding information back up through the network as well. So through OBCI, we sort of help to facilitate this flow of information, both in terms of data that are collected locally, as well as things that are happening at the broader scale and how we can apply that information to local levels as well. So in 2010, we published the first all-bird conservation plan. And this was really taking what the migratory bird joint ventures had done at a broad regional scale and stepping that down to Ohio. It was very literally a stepped down version of what those guys were. So we took all the information that they did at that regional scale for the entire Appalachians or the Great Lakes region, and we sort of scaled that down to Ohio. The goals of that were to identify a priority list of species. So what are the birds that occur in Ohio that need the most attention? That was step one. Stepping down those population and habitat goals. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Migratory Bird Joint Ventures did a lot of work to estimate the populations that are necessary to sustain some of these species and what habitats are needed to sustain those populations. Through that, identifying what do we need to do, where are our information gaps, what research projects do we need to implement to understand more. We don't know everything. Even though we've been studying birds for a really long time, we continue to find out really fascinating things, and there's so much that we don't know. So what are the most important research gaps, and how do we fill those? Everything is expensive, so how do we actually pay for a lot of that work, whether it's the research or it's land conservation or habitat improvement? That can cost billions of dollars. How do we deal with that? So the plan was an effort to help address those needs. Out of that first plan, we found really two big information gaps. One was the sort of lack of sustainable forest management, specifically for wildlife. Forest management had improved dramatically since even the mid-1900s, where we were high grading a lot of our forests. Eastern North America was cleared at one point in time, and all the forests that we have out there now are second or third generation forests. And a lot of what was left was not ideal. They took a lot of the great trees out, and they left a lot of the junk trees there. And so a lot of it comes down to restoration efforts for forests to get them back into healthy states. And then how do we manage our forests so that they are growing more healthy faster? Get to a place where we have really high quality forests for these birds, and not necessarily a lot of, I don't want to say junk trees, but less helpful trees or lower quality trees. So that was one effort. And the other was really addressing urban conservation. We've, as biologists and conservation biologists and managers, throughout much of North American history have focused on breeding season for birds. People for the longest time talked about birds as our birds, and then they go somewhere in the wintertime. Well, I can assure you, our birds are not our birds. They're here for a very small portion of their annual cycle. And there's this huge gap, even in between their overwintering periods and their breeding periods, that we don't know much about. And that is where we're finding a lot of those bottlenecks are. That's where a lot of the threats are occurring, and we're trying to find out more about migration. And I'll talk a lot about migration throughout the talk this evening, because that's where we're putting a lot of our emphasis moving forward. So those were the sort of two big areas. So after that, we worked with researchers and a lot of our partners to try to understand what's going on with forests. We want a better understanding of specifically what sorts of features in forests are birds keying in on, especially those species of conservation concern like the cerulean warbler. There was a really large multi-state project to study cerulean warblers that I actually, even before coming to Ohio, was a part of. I was a researcher in West Virginia through the Fish and Wildlife Cooperative Unit. We had field sites in the Monongahela National Forest and in western West Virginia as well. So there were around 5 states all implementing a variety of different silvicultural or timber harvesting practices to try to understand what sorts of small disturbances are actually beneficial for birds, because a lot of birds are disturbance specialists. Even cerulean warbler, which we consider this mature, large-scale forest species, actually likes really small-scale forest disturbance. Things like single-tree selection, where you might have a freeze that breaks branches off, or a single tree fall from a windstorm. These small disturbances create a lot of vertical structure in the forest that a lot of these birds actually find really attractive and really important. And so, that work was really important, and through that, we developed a guide for both professional foresters as well as private landowners on recommendations for how to manage their forested lands, their woodlots, for birds. And it was interesting, if we think about birds like Kentucky warbler, which is often associated with forests, but actually they are a disturbance specialist. They like really open canopies and really dense understories. So something like a shelter wood harvest or a thinning, where a lot of the trees are removed, but a canopy is left intact. That means there's all this dense vegetation in the understory, and that is what Kentucky warblers love. And so it was really trying to understand what are these relationships and how can we work with the timber industry or even state and federal land managers to manage those forests for these birds specifically, to create old growth style conditions where we have this sort of layered forest and not just an open understory. So, we've done a lot of work looking at different priority species of concern within the state of Ohio and what their needs are, not only during the breeding season, but during other stages of their annual cycle as well. Again, we spent so much time focusing on that nesting period and not really understanding what happens beyond that. For a lot of birds, even like cerulean warbler, they may use relatively mature forests during the breeding season. They often move into scrub habitat during the post-breeding season. So when the young fledge the nest, they often will move into things like clear cuts, sometimes even because of that dense cover. After the young leave the nest, there's this time period where birds undergo molt. Does anyone know what molt is? Feathers are all over the place, yeah. So these birds are flying thousands of miles a couple times a year. They need feathers that are in really good condition. So most songbirds change their feathers a couple times a year. When they do this, they're susceptible to predation. They can't fly as well. They have high energetic needs. So that dense scrub habitat provides one, cover from predators, but also a lot of food resources. Scrub habitat has lots of things like growing black raspberry in it, which has a lot of fruit, and a lot of insects on it. So high protein, high sugar, high energy, that helps them put on fat reserves, grow those feathers fastly, and it's really important. So we're learning more and more that birds have very complex life cycles, and throughout the year they may move into different habitat types that sort of break our understanding of what those associations are. So I try to steer people away from saying that's a forest bird or that's a field bird, because they may need lots of different habitats throughout their life cycle. And sometimes, we're still just trying to understand where these birds occur during the wintertime, let alone how they're using the habitat in those locations. Real quickly, I know this doesn't show up really well here, but this is an eastern whippoorwill, which is nightjar. That's a species of concern. It's been declining pretty rapidly. It's a scrub specialist. We associate it with forests, but they really like scrub habitat within a forested environment. Ruffed grouse. How many people have seen ruffed grouse here? How many people have seen ruffed grouse in the last 10 years? Pretty good. All right. Locally?
Southern Ohio.
Yeah. It's a species you have to really, really look for these days. Their populations have crashed, largely because of loss of habitat. They are a young forest species, even though we think about them in mature forests. This photograph, which doesn't show up real well here in the light conditions, is of a state game lands in central Pennsylvania, where they've had this long-term grouse study since the 1950s. And if you look at it, it looks like a checkerboard from an aerial photograph. And what it is very small-scale timber harvests embedded within mature forests. And so you've got this really dense scrub habitat embedded within a forested landscape. And the grouse was just thriving there for the longest time. I did my undergraduate degree at Penn State University, and I volunteered there as an undergraduate student to do surveys. And I used to walk transects and would just have grouse flying across my face all the time in that habitat. I haven't seen that in a really long time. It's largely because we've lost this matrix of habitat. Where we had small family farms throughout the state of Ohio, and fields would go fallow, or they would be left, we'd have small patches of forest and field scrub habitats. And for the most part, we either have large expanses of forest, or we have large expanses of agriculture. And It's sort of that interspersion of these habitats where a lot of these species have declined. And so really over the last 15 years almost, we've been working with both professional foresters and private landowners to give them resources to manage woods that they own and manage. And so we've done workshops throughout the state. That's primarily been done in southeastern Ohio, but we're now working with a number of partners to expand that to agricultural landscapes and urbanized landscapes. So people who have very small woodlots, we can't give them the same recommendations for the people who live in the Athens area. That's apples and oranges. You can't say, well, if you want to manage this 50 or 100 acre woodlot, someone might have 2.5 acres that they manage. And so we have to have a different set of recommendations for that. And so here's an aerial photograph showing you sort of southeastern Ohio compared to northwestern Ohio and northeastern Ohio. Very different landscapes. And so any recommendations that we make have to be very specific to that landscape. So this map is illustrating forest connectivity in the state of Ohio. So the darker colors indicate that that's a more contiguous forest patch. You can see that, yes, we have most of the contiguous forest in southern and southeastern Ohio. And it's hard to see on the map, but there's lots and lots of little green and yellow checker dots throughout northwestern Ohio. Those are really important. We cannot ignore those because, yes, these forested landscapes are used by these species of conservation concern, like cerulean warbler, for breeding habitat, for post-breeding, for migratory staging. And we're never going to get cerulean warbler in some of these forest woodlots in northwestern Ohio. However, these woodlots are critically important for transient migrants. So birds that don't nest in the state of Ohio, but pass through here during spring and fall migration. We are an important truck stop on the way to where they're going. Think about our landscape is a series of gas stations for migratory birds. The smaller the gas station, it's sort of lower quality. As you know, if you have a bunch of 7-Elevens, you want to have a lot of 7-Elevens close by. You can't get good quality food and energy from a 7-Eleven. But if you have a Whole Foods or something like that, you might be able to stretch it a little bit farther because you're putting on really good energetic body condition. And so we have to work with landowners in this landscape to improve those woodlots for migratory birds. So this is a blackpoll warbler. They do not nest in Ohio. They're boreal breeding, so they sort of nest near the tree line in northern Canada. And they are a species of conservation concern. Their populations have been declining. They overwinter in northern and South America. But Ohio is critically important to this species population. It's really fascinating to think about this species and their sort of annual journey. During the springtime, they sort of come up to northern and South America. They fly over the Gulf of Mexico to the southeastern United States and come up through the Appalachian Mountains. Once they get to Ohio, they start to fan out across the Great Lakes into Canada. So we are sort of this inflection point for a lot of boreal birds. They funnel down through the Great Lakes area into the Appalachian Mountains. What's cool about blackpoll warbler is they don't take that same journey south to South America. What we've learned in recent years is they actually come to the western Lake Erie Basin. They gorge themselves on dogwoods and American hackberry fruits in those marshes. And then they sort of work their way across Ohio and West Virginia and Pennsylvania to the Atlantic coast, where they then take a transatlantic jump from the coast in New Jersey down to South America. They can only do that because they fattened up in the western Lake Erie Basin. So if we sort of ignore these woodlots and that habitat, we could potentially be affecting this entire global population of this species. So we need to think beyond Ohio for a lot of what we do when we talk about conservation of these bird populations. It's more than what we're doing here. And finally, our states and federal agencies are beginning to see that. The Ohio Division of Wildlife has finally started investing in a global program called Southern Wings, which actually can take some of their money for conservation and invest it to local partners in South America who are working on wintering habitats for our birds, or the birds that just kind of pass through here at times. And so it's been really, really fascinating and encouraging to see that. I guess I spoiled this a little too soon. But I'll encourage you, if you haven't yet gone to eBird, the website, do that. And you can click on the science tab and just explore this for days. Now, for hundreds of species, they have maps like this showing the relative weekly abundance of a species across the calendar year. And so there's a lot of information being displayed here. So this is showing you the calendar from January 1st through the end of December. You can see as this moves across, that population changes. So again, a lot of these species, and this is very representative of neotropical warblers. They come up through eastern North America, they hit the Great Lakes area, and then fan out across boreal Canada. So eastern North America, and especially Ohio and other places around the Great Lakes, are really important for a lot of these special birds. And this is an area of research that's really been expanding in the last 10 years, and we've seen a lot of growth in the last even 2 to 5 years. Trying to understand this full annual cycle and how urban areas affect birds. There was a paper published in 2014 that we cite all the time that tried to quantify how many birds die from bird-building collisions. And what they found was pretty staggering. In the US alone, somewhere up to 1 billion birds die per year, just in the US from flying into windows, like the ones you see behind you here in our homes. There was a paper published just a few weeks ago from Dan Clem, who really pioneered a lot of the collision research. He's based at a small university in Pennsylvania. Showed that we're actually missing 70% of the birds that fly off site and die later on. So that estimate is probably 70% higher than what we thought it was. So 1.7 billion birds per year die in bird-building collisions. There's another really great paper that came out in 2018 using eBird data and Next-Rad radar to actually follow birds as they move across the landscape during migration. And what they found was that during migration, so a lot of the songbirds that we get really excited about, so like warbler, blackpoll warbler, scarlet tanager, they're nocturnal migrants, meaning they're doing most of this trip at night, guided in part by stars and nocturnal light. What these researchers found was that these birds were moving away from high-quality forested areas where there's a lot of really great resources into urban landscapes because of that light attraction. And in these landscapes, they're exposed to more threats, things like reflective glass that they fly into, increased rates of predators, especially non-native predators like free-ranging domestic and feral cats. So that's really contributing to a lot of these population declines is that during migration. But how do we deal with that? That's the tricky part of all this. If we think about breeding or overwintering habitats, we can spend a lot of time working on large-scale private and public lands to manage them. But if we think about urban landscapes, we may have thousands of stakeholders in a really concentrated area. How do you deal with that? We can't even come to any agreements as a species on what we need to do on a day-to-day basis, but thinking about how we manage these landscapes for migratory wildlife, for species that most people never even heard of, let alone have seen in their life, it's a really difficult challenge to try to address. And that's something that we've been working on through these Lights Out programs for a number of years, and we're finally starting to get some traction. And I'll talk a little bit more about what has led to some of that success. So we developed Ohio Lights Out as a small-scale study in Columbus in 2012 that has since expanded to 7 cities throughout Ohio, and Lights Out Miami Valley has been running since 2015, and there are actually lots and lots of buildings enrolled in this area in the program. And the goal with that is try to engage building managers in managing their properties, just like this one, to make them a little bit more bird-friendly. Starting with reducing as much artificial light at night as possible, and then hopefully we can start talking about glass mitigation as well, treating reflective glass to sort of break up that reflectivity. That is a little more challenging because of the price tag associated with glass treatment. This has also evolved into a really broad-scale citizen science or community science efforts. We now have over 250 volunteers that are walking around in some of these cities on a day-to-day basis during migration, looking for injured and dead birds that have hit buildings. And through this effort, we have salvaged over 20,000 birds. Most of that has come just in the last few years, and most of it has come from Cleveland, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's a reason for that. But this effort has given us new insight into non-breeding species occurrence and vulnerabilities. And this is a really great case study for that. Connecticut warbler. Who here has seen Connecticut warbler? We've got 2 people that have seen Connecticut warbler. This is a highly sought after bird. They are really elusive, they're skulky, they don't vocalize a whole lot, they're creepy little dudes. They just pass right through during migration. They're really hard to find, that's why people really go after them. We don't really know how abundant they are during migration because they are so secretive and elusive. The Cleveland Museum of Natural History had 6 Connecticut warblers in their collection prior to our Lights Out surveys, which started in 2017. Since that, we've salvaged 45 that were just collected around Public Square, Cleveland, since 2017. So that tells us that species is here in much higher numbers than we thought it was. And it's difficult to understand how these populations are for secret species. And so it's given us a lot of new insight into how we might adapt additional surveys to sort of capture some of these species that are moving through that are very hard to detect, and how we manage for some of these populations. So we've had 2 graduate students and multiple undergraduate students at different universities working on various aspects of this project. And actually right now I'm in the process of hiring a full-time Lights Out coordinator. I'm really excited about that. So this effort is growing and growing, and we're working more and more on urban conservation. I mentioned that there was a recent publication that was just out a few weeks ago updating our estimate of mortality from bird building collisions. So part of that was trying to understand what detectability is like for birds that hit windows, they're injured, and maybe they don't die on site. There's this sort of understanding, we all kind of assume that there are a lot of birds that hit windows and then they fly off and they die elsewhere and we never find them. So that 1 billion birds per year should really be seen as a low conservative estimate. But we don't know how much higher that actually is. So we worked with partners at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh. They've got a field study station in southwestern Pennsylvania called Powdermill. This is the longest running year-round bird banding station in North America. They've been banding birds there since 1966. They reached out to us because Bird Safe Pittsburgh had a data problem. They had a sample size issue. They couldn't get enough collision birds in downtown Pittsburgh, so they reached out to us. For better or worse, we find a lot of birds in downtown Cleveland, so we were able to help them out with this data issue. What they were interested in was trying to understand what that mortality, what is that missing number, that hidden number? What are the birds that are hitting windows, they're injured, what's happening to them afterwards? So we worked with them, we chose a small number of species to put transmitters on. So our volunteers, as they were walking downtown, if they found one of these species, a target species that was alive, and they were successfully rehabilitated, we put a little backpack transmitter on and followed them around to see what happened. So this American woodcock was one of our target species, and this one in particular was a bird that hit downtown Cleveland. Our volunteers were actually walking around, and one of our volunteers saw this specific bird fly into a building, get injured, and fall down. They ran over it, they rescued it, they took it. All of our birds in Cleveland go to the Lake Erie Nature and Science Center on the west end of town. This bird was successfully rehabilitated, it was doing really well, so we put a transmitter, a Otis, a nanotag on the back of it, and set it free. And there's this series of radio towers across the globe, but especially in northeastern North America, called Lotus. And it's traditional VHF telemetry, but they're all in the same frequency, and so they communicate with each other. So if a bird carrying one of these transmitters, or a bat, or a dragonfly, you'd be amazed at the things they're putting these transmitters on, fly by it, these towers are able to detect it. So each transmitter has a unique pulse rate. That's how they're able to identify individuals. It kind of sounds like Morse code. So when one of these tagged birds flies by it, it emits this pulse, and the radio towers pick it up. So these stars on the map are actually the story of this particular American woodcock. So the green stars are the locations where it was detected in the spring. So this bird was released from Lake Erie Nature and Science Center. It did cross Lake Erie, flying over into the Toronto area, and it flew further north, and we assume that this bird nested somewhere in the Algonquin Provincial Park of Canada. It was picked up again in the fall, farther east towards Ottawa, and it came down across the lakes again. Was picked up in New York, and then it was picked up in southern North Carolina. So as far as we could tell, this bird did what it was supposed to, and it lived a normal life and a healthy life, and we assumed that it at least attempted to breed. So this was a good story, meaning that it didn't suffer serious injury and was able to go about its normal life. We do have other individuals, some of our study species like magnolia warbler and gray catbird, that did things that weren't expected. We had a tagged gray catbird flying to extreme northwestern Canada, much farther beyond its breeding range, and a magnolia fly due east out towards the Atlantic Ocean. So we assume that these birds had some sort of head trauma. There's been a lot of research in professional athletes, human athletes in recent years, about how head trauma manifests later in life to psychological and cognitive issues. The same likely happens with birds. And so we're sort of underestimating the impact of bird-building collisions if we're only looking at the birds that we find at the buildings. And so we're trying to do more research like this with our partners to understand what the magnitude of this issue really is. And we're finally starting to see this translate into conservation success. The Cleveland State University School of Law was the first in the area to treat the glass on their campus. So their law library had a lot of trees around it. It was a very reflective glass building, as you can see here, and they installed a product called Feather Friendly, which just puts a tiny little grid of dots on the window so that we can still see through it, but birds can recognize it as a surface. Cuyahoga County has committed to treating all of the buildings that they own and operate in downtown Cleveland. They started this effort about a year and a half ago. It will include the convention center, the Hilton Hotel, and a lot of the buildings in downtown Cleveland. And we're really excited about that effort and their commitment to sustainability. And super exciting is news that we just announced a few weeks ago, is that Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse is going to be treating all of the glass on the north facade of their stadium. This is the big bird killer in downtown Cleveland. The vast majority of our birds are found at Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. It is a continuous glass surface that is right off the lake. So a lot of birds hit it. It's sad, you can go to this building during peak migration day and stand, and birds will fall on you as they hit the glass down. So we're really excited about working with the team there. They're committed to addressing this issue and also working within the community to get more buildings to treat the glass in that area. They're using a product called waterbirds, which is it's similar to Feather Friendly, but it's a UV product, meaning that we can't see it all that well. But birds have extended vision. They can see, most species can see in ultraviolet and near infrared. And so birds will actually see what we don't see on this building. So this is going to be an interesting experiment. It's the first large-scale bird-to-bird project that I know of in Eastern North America. So we're really excited about that. It's actually going to get installed in July. We'll be ready for fall migration. So that was a big success. The other part of the all-bird conservation plan was really the reliance on community science projects. And I've talked about this a little bit already. And we're using eBird more and more in our conservation planning. There's now so much data in eBird that they can do things that they never imagined they could do, like look at spatially distinct population declines. And so this was the first product that was done. This was published in 2018. This is the abundance trend for wood thrush, the species of conservation concern. This is a species that is declining dramatically throughout its breeding range, but it's not consistent. So if you look at this range, it's actually increasing in some of its breeding range. And if we zoom into Ohio, so they now have sub-region data available, and this was just published earlier this year, where you can actually dive down to the state level and look at population trends. Our wood thrush population is actually doing quite well. It's increasing here in Ohio, and this is something that I've observed in my 15 years working in the state here, and it's fascinating to me. I think we're going to try to get some graduate students working on the third breeding bird atlas to try to understand why is a species that is supposed to be area sensitive and need high quality forest doing really well at the periphery of its breeding range in more fragmented, lower quality forests. When I was working on the second breeding bird atlas in Ohio, I would find wood thrush in every single isolated woodlot in western Ohio. I know they're here, but we don't understand what their breeding success is. We don't know if they're fledging successful broods. So that's something we want to look at. But as far as we can tell, the population is doing really well in Ohio, places like Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, differentiate their work. So that second breeding bird atlas was really important. It was a very large scale effort. We had a little over 900 volunteers in that effort. Those bird watchers just went out all over the state of Ohio and documented every bird that they saw during the breeding season. And they submitted over 1 million breeding bird observations, and we were able to use those data to work with the Division of Wildlife to update their state listing status. So every 5 years, the Ohio Division of Wildlife reviews all of the state listed sort of threatened, endangered species of concern, and they reach out to experts. So I've been able to be a part of the last 3 cycles of this, where we've provided data that we have in our understanding of these populations to recommend changes. And so these are all of the changes that sort of came out of the last few cycles, mostly from the second atlas of breeding birds in Ohio. So it's some good stories and some not so good stories. We've got some success, so we're able to downgrade the conservation status of sandhill crane and Kirtland's warbler. Kirtland's warbler was federally enlisted, even though it doesn't breed here in Ohio, but because they passed through here and they're federally enlisted, they had to be listed at the state level as well. When they were downgraded and delisted at the federal level, that sort of trickled down through Ohio, and that's how that change resulted. But sandhill crane populations have been booming in recent years. And we also have an Ohio crane count now that we do every year in April, and that has shown an increase in cranes every year over the last few years. Some of these are not great stories. I mentioned the story of the ruffed grouse. That is a species that continues to decline. Researchers in neighboring states are now understanding that West Nile virus might be a big part of that story for that species. So even beyond their reduced habitats, West Nile virus is prevalent in the population in Pennsylvania and presumably West Virginia as well. So there are a lot of researchers looking at that. They seem quite susceptible to that. And then there's species of special interest, meaning they may be doing well outside of the state of Ohio, but we're kind of on the edge of their range. And some of these are expanding into Ohio. So common merganser is one that's increasing, both across northeastern Ohio and from southeastern Ohio as well. This is a very large cavity nesting duck species, and so they're really cool to see. It's exciting to see. There have been a number of new sightings in the Athens area for common merganser, and we're excited about that. The whole point of this is to work with agencies that make the decisions that take the regulatory action. So we're actually right now in the middle of a state wildlife action plan update. In fact, I think you're organizing the next meeting in this particular area. So all of the districts of the DNR across the states are holding a series of meetings to work with experts in various taxonomic fields to have a say in the next state wildlife action plan. And everything that we did with the all-bird conservation plan was specifically so that we could make recommendations for this state wildlife action plan, as well as a number of other plans, to really work with conservation agencies. So it had been over a decade since the previous plan was published, and so we had a lot of work to really expand what we were doing. So the goals were quite similar. We really wanted to understand what was going on with the birds that occur here in Ohio. One of the changes that we made was really to expand our understanding of what that temporal window is. Not just looking at the birds that nest here in the state, but those species like black-polled warbler that just pass through here. We acknowledge that Ohio is really important to those populations, so what can we do to help them out, and what does that list of species look like? Also acknowledging that birders have a big say in this. A lot of the information that we have, we would not know without bird watchers. And so really embracing bird-based recreation and trying to integrate that into our conservation plan so that we can encourage bird watchers to make more bird watchers and to submit observations of birds. And to identify new research and monitoring needs. And I'll talk about some of those projects that we've identified here at the end of the talk. A big part of it too is acknowledging the human dimensions aspect of this. We learned the hard way as we tried to solve these issues in urban landscapes. It's challenging. Not everyone thinks about birds the same way that we do or that you do. And so we have to understand that humans are part of this equation. We've drastically changed the landscape and we manage that landscape. And so understanding that we have to include social science as part of this, any recommendations that we make. So we had a pretty large team of 16 folks based at different institutions and universities throughout the state of Ohio working on this. Kelly Williams was the lead author. She's faculty at Ohio University in Athens. And she really pushed this effort to get accomplished. And it was a lot of work and it took us a while. So we started this effort in 2018. It did take a little longer than we were expecting because of that weird thing that happened in 2020. It's still happening, but that slowed us down a little bit and we had to rethink what we were doing. But we did publish this guide really last year. One of the things that we did differently than the first time around, and what a lot of broad-based collaboratives do, is we took a habitat focus and not a taxonomic focus. So if you go to the Partners in Flight or the Migratory Bird Joint Ventures, you'll find different conservation plans for songbirds, for waterfowl, for waterbirds and shorebirds. And there is some redundancy built into that because there are songbirds that use wetlands, and there are shorebirds that nest away from the shore. So we wanted to make sure that we were really providing information for land managers, people who could implement this work on the landscape. So we divided that into sort of two main chapters, a largely terrestrial and one that's more aquatic focused, to think about how we think about and manage these birds. Again, we really wanted this stronger emphasis on the full annual cycle ecology. So not just looking at breeding birds of special interest or conservation concern like Houston whippoorwill we talked about. King rail is a marsh bird that is a species of regional conservation concern that breeds here in Ohio. But we wanted to look at those transient migrants that use Ohio as well. So black-polled warbler, which I mentioned. Short-billed dowitcher is one that's of regional concern that passes through Ohio in really large numbers. And then overwintering species. American tree sparrow is one that is of great interest of the Mississippi River Great Lakes joint venture. It's declining in a lot of its range in Canada. They don't understand why. So this is the species that we included, and common loon as well, which overwinters here in the state of Ohio, and their populations have been declining as well. And this is really important, and I spend a lot of time trying to illustrate this just because of that importance. So this is a veery. Raise your hand if you've seen or heard veery before in Ohio. A few of you, yeah, it's a relatively common transient migrant. They come through in decent numbers during spring and fall migration. But if you were interested in seeing a veery and you opened up the species account in the Breeding Bird Atlas, this is the map you'd be greeted with. They're largely nesting in northeastern Ohio with a few scattered locations throughout the state. But if you go to eBird and you type in veery and you pull up the range map, you're going to get this purple blob over the state of Ohio. And that's because they're really common transient migrants. If you go out during migration, you're probably going to see or hear a veery. They come through here in great numbers. And so we have a lot that we can contribute to the species population by managing our lands and forested lands for that special time period. Here's another one of those maps. Researchers have just found in recent years that veeries actually have two discrete overwintering distributions. So early on in the winter, they're moving to the southern Amazon basin. You'll see that this map doesn't actually include a wintering range. That's because there's so little data on this and we're still learning about it. If you open up any field guides, you go to the library, or you go to your own collection of field guides, and you open up a lot of the songbirds' winter range, you're going to see a giant blob over South America. That's not because they're found everywhere in South America. That's because we don't really know where in South America those species are found. And researchers have found recently that for veery, they're actually moving to the southern Amazon basin during the first part of winter. And as resources change seasonally with seasonal drought and wet seasons, they move to northern South America, places like northern Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador, during the second half of winter before they actually come to North America during the winter season. So really trying to understand what these species need and not think about them as this is where they breed, this is where they don't breed. It's all this stuff that's happening in between for all the time. And so for all of our focal species, we have these full species accounts in there where we're looking at what's happening at the state level, what's happening at the national level, and what's happening at the global level as well. And so we pulled data from the Breeding Bird Survey, eBird, Ohio Breeding Bird Atlas, to try to capture that all in there. And so there's a two-page spread for all the 74 species that are in that plan. We also did a more thorough assessment of urban landscapes. Again, because we're trying to take that full annual cycle approach, we worked with researchers to understand urban landscapes, particularly where these urban landscapes occur, and how bird-based recreation fits into that. So if we take a map of where high-quality habitat and maybe poor-quality urbanized habitat is, and overlay that with birding behavior, most people bird in the places that they live, and so you'll see that there's actually a higher number of birders in urban landscapes because of that. But there's this overlap period, and those are the areas of opportunity where people are willing to travel close enough to those urban landscapes. And so we did this cost-benefit analysis to try to identify these locations around the state that are open. We actually have an opportunity to conserve there, and people can be invested in these lands as well. The next step of this is really to work on implementation. So we want to work with our partners around the state to have implementation workshops, whether it's a Metro Parks district or the state or the feds, to try to understand what are you doing on the property that you manage and what are your neighbors doing as well. The Wayne National Forest, for example, has led a community effort to engage all of the private landowners that have land that is in the area of the Wayne National Forest. And if they have property that is adjacent to the forest, they can actually include it in their management plan. If they're doing a controlled burn or something, they will actually help the landowner to incorporate their lands into that management plan as well. So trying to look at it from a community perspective so that we're engaging everyone in these efforts. We, as I mentioned, I'm super excited about this. We are starting to plan for the next breeding bird atlas, and we're actually going to do a concurrent winter bird atlas as well. So it's going to be year rounds of birding and bird atlasing, which I'm really excited about. Planning for that starts this coming fiscal year, so in about a week and a half, we're officially starting to work on the atlas, and field work will begin in 2028 and go through 2032. That seems very futuristic, but it's not that far away. We have a lot of work to prepare for that. And during this time, during this planning stage, we really want to work with lots and lots of different researchers, especially on those things like human dimensions. And so in the school that I work, the School of Environment and Natural Resources, we actually have a really big social science and human dimensions faculty group, and we're working with them to try to identify projects, research that they can do concurrent with the atlas to work with bird watchers, landowners, to try to understand their interests, their willingness to participate in it, and how we can understand more about not only the birds, but the humans that are in that bird landscape as well. The other thing that I find really exciting is that we're moving to daily checklists instead of just a season or a block checklist. So in the past, we would identify, break the state up into a grid of blocks, and somebody would sign up for one of those blocks, and they just had to find every species in that block. The trick with that, or the trouble with that is, once you observe a bird once and you confirm it, you largely ignored it after that. So it's really difficult to get phenological information or dates on when things are happening. The current generation of Atlas projects are moving to a daily checklist, which is basically like e-birding every time you go out. So every time an Atlaser goes out, they submit a complete checklist of all the birds that they saw or heard and the breeding codes associated with them. With that means we're going to get a lot more data and allow us to look at things like breeding phenology. So I'm on the publication committee for Wisconsin's second breeding bird atlas, and they're in the middle of analyzing their data now. It's just finished up a couple years ago. And this is an example of the chronological plot from theory, that species that we just looked at. And so these different colored dots are different breeding codes. So the ones here on the bottom are sort of the lowest level of confidence. The bird was just seen in the area, or maybe it was singing. The colors in the bars at the top are the confirmed, so they saw fledged young, or they saw a nest with young, or adults feeding young. And we can actually plot every observation that was submitted for this species and look at things like early and late dates, and especially when the bulk of those observations are happening. So if we do this multiple generations of atlas over time, we can see how this shifts with things like climate change, because we want to see what the phenological response these large-scale, both temporal and spatial changes are. And so I'm really excited about that. It means a lot of data. It's going to be millions and millions of data. We're actually going to be hiring a data scientist postdoc to help us develop some database tools to accommodate all this data that we're expecting. The other thing is really applying this to research efforts. So we've identified some gaps through this effort. We know we don't know everything. And the trick now is to let's start to fill those gaps. And so we're working with research. And again, Kelly Williams is taking the lead on some of this work. She's had a couple of graduate students now, and we just are working on a collaborative NSF grant to continue this work over the next few years to try to understand habitat selection, survival, and movement of birds that will winter here, especially sparrows that most people are not going to go out to fields and look at when it's cold and windy, and little brown birds. And so we're putting these nano tags, those motor transmitters, on American tree sparrow, dark-eyed junco, and following them around. Jacob Morgan, the graduate student on the right here, has already found some really fascinating things with dark-eyed junco and the habitat that they're using during the wintering season, and how that can translate to how landowners and farmers can manage their fields during the off-season. We just also had a graduate student who finished up, Zoe Corby. She was looking at lake crossing behavior of neotropical migrants, so largely birds that are overwintering in Central and South America, but we also looked at a few temperate migrants as well. White-throated sparrow and yellow-rumped warbler were two species we were looking at to see how they were moving around the lake. But past studies had focused on right at the lake, so they were just looking at species or individuals making those final decisions. What was novel about Zoe's work is that she was looking more inland to see how far back were these birds making these decisions to go around really large barriers like the Great Lakes to get to breeding grounds in Canada. And so I actually, with my wife, run a bird banding station in southeastern Ohio, and we were tagging birds for her study as part of this effort as well. And it was interesting to see some of the species differences as they move across the lake. White-throated sparrows were kind of fanning out, and some were crossing the lake and some were going around. A lot of the long-distance warblers, so magnolia warbler and Tennessee warbler, were largely sticking to an eastern route and going around the Great Lakes. Whereas Swainson's thrush was also kind of crossing the Great Lakes largely, and some were going around. So it was interesting to see these taxonomic differences. So that helps us to understand, as we understand what those populations are, and if we're trying to manage for them, we can take that into account as Recommendations for energy development come up. This area is one that's growing rapidly for both solar and wind energy, both green energies. They're green from a carbon standpoint though. We don't really understand, at least in this landscape, what that sustainability means as it affects migratory wildlife. The Great Lakes is probably not a great place to put a bunch of windmills, is what we're finding out. So siting is really important for that, and there are researchers at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and a few other places trying to understand what solar is looking like in our landscape as well, because most of the work has been done in Western North America, where solar farms are very large at a very different scale and magnitude of what is being proposed here. And so it's interesting, it's good to understand these sort of species level behaviors and understand how that might impact populations moving forward. The plan and a lot of additional information is available on our website. You can download this as a PDF. It's a big PDF, I'll warn you in advance, it's a few hundred pages. But if you're interested in a lot of those nuts and bolts, I encourage you to check it out. I also just encourage you to go to ebird.org and click on the science tab. You could spend hours, if not days, if not weeks, just staring at those animated maps. I know I have, and I have to catch myself sometimes. I find them really fascinating. They're constantly putting out new products, so I encourage you to check that out. If you have any questions, happy to talk to you now if we have time, or hang out afterwards as well. And that's my email address, so you can get in touch if you have anything that comes up after tonight, or maybe you didn't want to talk about it. You can get in touch anytime, and I'd be happy to talk to you about birds, bird conservation, birders, anything. So thank you. Yes, sir.
On the earlier slide, when we were talking about the eBird data on moon thrushes and how their population is migrating more here, are those scales absolute numbers or percentages?
They're relative, yeah. And so you can click on there and they'll give you information on the sources of data and what that scale looks like. So the size of the dot and the color of the dot matter. So it's the amount of data included, the confidence level around that, and also the magnitude of that. So yeah, the size of the dots are different as well as the color intensity as well. So you can get information on all those right on every one of those maps. And you can actually download the data if you're interested in looking into those sorts of things as well. Yes, sir.
Are studies being done on global warming and how it's affecting the birds?
Yes, there's been quite a bit of research, and so that's one of the things that we're really interested in getting that phenological data so that we can take a closer look at that. My wife actually did a postdoc at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History using Powder-Mill's long-term bird banding data set and looking at climate change at the species level and at taxonomic groups as well, trying to understand are birds arriving earlier, how does arrival also affect their nest initiation, and sort of the breeding phenology and how that changes. And what a lot of researchers are finding is that it varies by species. There is potentially some plasticity, but at some point there's going to be a disconnect because it all comes down to food. And these birds are migrating, and migratory cues are based on photo period. So when you're in Colombia or you're in Ecuador, you don't know what the temperature is in Ohio. You know what it is in Ecuador or Colombia. And so birds have evolved this strategy that as the amount of daylight changes, the hormones in their body change, and that photo period really prompts them to move. They get antsy, and they start moving at that point. Photo period doesn't change with climate change. That's static. But climate change may affect when insects are hatching out at certain times. And evolutionarily, those species, bird species, have evolved to arrive when the food source is ready for them. So what we're finding is that there might be a period where the food source isn't going to peak when the birds are coming through, and so it'll be difficult to get to the breeding grounds in good condition, meaning they may not nest successfully, or they may initiate nesting later if they fail. So it seems that right now there's some plasticity in that, but as that expands more, we're likely going to break some of those relationships and go into some issues there. There's a lot of work with forests as well. The Forest Service has a project that we're working on, some concurrent bird research. It's called Silviculture for Adaptive Climate Change. And they're looking at assisted migration as well as different strategies to encourage local phenotypes of tree species as well to come up at certain times. Predicting that we're going to shift to more of an oak-based system here because of drier, warmer climates, and that will likely affect food sources. But again, timing is it's very, very complex, and there's a lot of research right now looking into climate change, and some of the folks that I work with as well.
I wonder about noise pollution and birds. That's just like a big.
Yeah, there's yeah.
During COVID, when they closed down all the factories around Ohio, we saw birds in our backyard. We've never seen more horses.
Yeah, there's been a lot of, this is gone out, so there's been a lot of research looking behaviorally at noise pollution as well, and there's been some evidence that some species are actually changing the frequency of their songs to overcome urban noise pollution. Northern cardinals will actually do it in urban environments. They will shift their songs to a higher pitch to overcome that baseline traffic noise. And that has been an evolutionary shift in some places where birds in urban that are primarily in urban landscapes, their songs are actually getting higher pitch and higher frequency as an adaptation to that. So there are lots of behavioral adaptations to noise pollution. There's some changes in occupancy as well. Working with folks who were looking at things like the expansion of Marcellus Shale, and those large fracturing pads generate a lot of noise. They might not impact a lot of the habitat per se, but we need to consider the acoustic environment as being part of that habitat as well. And birds weren't occupying some of what looked like good habitat because of the noise pollution there. They're not able to transmit song effectively in some of these locations. Questions? Yes?
Going back to the citizen science efforts, what are some of the things that kind of just us as humans can do to either help, the research you're doing or anything like that?
I mean, just getting an interest in bird watching and exploring eBird is a great first step. Everybody can do it. I know there's a lot of hesitance. People think there's the imposter syndrome. I can't submit records. That's only for real bird watchers. You're all real bird watchers if you like birds. And what they're looking at really is when people, part of the eBird submission process is when you submit, mark down all the birds that you've seen or you can identify, there's one final question that says, are you submitting a complete checklist? That doesn't mean you were able to find every bird that's in the area. That just means, did you write down all the birds that you can identify? And that's a big part of it. They're actually able to do, because there's so much data, they're actually able to accommodate a lot of random effects, so things like observer and season. And even though you exist as a number, they know who you are, and they can see your patterns over time and how that deviates from expected patterns of bird watching. So more data helps. And so I would say if you're interested in this at all, submit the birds that are in your backyard as a start. The cardinals and the song sparrows and the house sparrows too. We need to know about them and how their populations are changing. Everybody can do that, and it's a great first step. And from there, eBird does fun things like Global Big Day, and they coordinate Nest Watch and Feeder Watch and the Great Backyard Bird Count. So I would say eBird's a good gateway drug to bigger projects to get involved with. So everybody start an eBird account after today if you don't already have one.
Well, thank you so much for the EcoTalk today. And you'll be around for a little bit if you guys have questions afterwards as well.
Thank you all for coming.